Hello. For this talk, I'm going to try something completely different, and that is, I'm recording this while I'm driving down the highway. And ordinarily, I would follow kind of the dictates by some that say, record it in the most quiet area possible of your home, let's say. But I started to think that if I were to wait until doing that, I probably might procrastinate on this particular talk until it never gets done. So, also, at one time I was such a huge perfectionist, and I think it's better to create something as long as the content is good and put it out there with noises and imperfections rather than to let it be postponed until the better day, which might be never, actually. And so this is going to be a joint venture for me anyway, on both putting out some ideas and working on my own issues with perfectionism. And I think this can be useful to anyone to contemplate what perfectionism is all about. So, without further ado, I want to launch into the topic here, and that is, why is beauty so sought after? Well, I know some people would complain, actually, if not gifted with what you'd call universally accepted beauty in certain cultures. They would complain that it's not fair that beauty trumps a character that is refined, good character, loving, compassionate, and so on. But what if actually beauty is actually kind of a unconscious registering in the mind of actually what a good character is? That perhaps what we call beauty often ties in very closely with personality traits that we also find very pleasing. So when we say so-and-so is not beautiful, perhaps what we're thinking on an unconscious level particularly is that they have personality traits that we really don't find very pleasing, that correlate very commonly with that particular look about their body, basically. So I'd like to look at this, and this is just some observations, and it's not ironclad, and everybody has their own opinions, but I'd like to present this as something to think about anyway. So, again, I believe, for instance, there's a book by Eric Berne in the 1950s. He was a noted popular psychoanalyst at the time, and he said, amongst other things in one of his books during that period, that a great way to assess people is by their body type. And there was a Dr. Sheldon sometime around that period who also said the same thing, that body type is very indicative of personality. Well, I suppose after that point in time that may have gone to the wayside, and it is rather statistically difficult to prove, I suppose, in a laboratory, but at any rate, here are some of my thoughts on this as to why a body type, for instance, may tie in with what we consider beautiful or not, and various personality issues tying in too. So, for instance, I'm reminded of a comedian talking about women and vulnerability to violence. And the comedian, George Carlin, was talking in a video on women that, in his opinion, women are so much more vulnerable to violence from men because of smaller size and less musculature and so on. And perhaps, in my opinion, less proneness to aggression by less testosterone in general, and more empathy built into their genetics too. And so, George Carlin was pointing out that women are more susceptible to violence because of their body type. They're less able to defend themselves. And once I read a book, PTSD for Dummies, and it was saying that, according to the author, it may have been a Dr. Goulston, that women have more tendency to develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, because of their smaller size. Again, correlating to what George Carlin was saying in a somewhat more humorous manner by George. And perhaps a little more caustic too, but at any rate. Well, what about men? What about beauty in men? What do we associate beauty to be in men? Well, it strikes me that one factor is that I think most women do not find very tall and thin men very sexually attractive. And my thinking at the present point is that this tends to be sometimes a rather unconscious reaction, and with some or more substantiation to it, whereby a thin, tall man, call him an ectomorph if you will, is, in my opinion, far more likely to be vulnerable to physical attack, starting in childhood with bullying and so on, where, especially in a culture where carrying of weapons right out in the open is not only frowned upon but typically illegal, it being very hard for a tall, thin man to defend himself with no significant body mass there to throw around or musculature. And furthermore, that these people, these tall, thin men, are much more vulnerable to injury if punched or hit by someone of bigger stature, mesomorphic, let's say, or short even. And so again, more vulnerable. If you were to punch a tall ectomorphic man, or if he were even saber-rattled, so to speak, into worrying that this could possibly happen, what the result will be, in my opinion, is a lot of anxiety. And while there may be a genetic component that makes tall, thin men more anxious in general, I would say, ironically, there's a genetic component in that he's more frail and thus vulnerable to injury, especially if not carrying a weapon. Let's say in front of him at the ready, almost as if going into combat. For can you imagine soldiers going onto the battlefield if infantrymen with no weapons? Well, that's kind of the case with tall, thin men in certain cultures that are heavily predisposed to violence. So naturally, I would say most ectomorphic, in other words, tall, thin men, are far more predisposed to anxiety levels that are much greater than those of mesomorphics, simply because they're not carrying weapons of a muscular nature, which are legal to carry without a permit, let's say. With a little bit of humor I'm adding in here. One doesn't have to get a concealed weapon permit to carry muscles or a little bit of extra weight compared to the tall, thin man. So this registers, I would say, on the tall, thin, ectomorphic man. And what do you have? You have higher levels of innate, I would say, anxiety. And I'm not so sure that this is very considerably due to genetics, let's say, in the nerve endings of the brain or the muscles themselves, making these people then more skittish, if you will, more prone to flinching, say. I think there's a very heavy component simply to the vulnerability to being injured, and they're knowing it on an unconscious level at the least. Now, I would say then at this point that this is related to beauty or sexual attractiveness, say, in the following ways. That, first of all, it's my opinion from observation that those people of tall, thin build, let's say, I'm talking mostly of men now because I'm a man, are going to be compensating for their high levels of anxiety compared to those not tall and thin by several means, like obsessive compulsive disorder, or in other words, trying to control things excessively to make sure you aren't injured. Whether we're talking injured to the point of death or let's say just physical injury, particularly if it results in maiming. In other words, chronic injury that doesn't heal. And the issue then being discomfort on a chronic basis. Let's say you were punched in the face. Well, maybe your nose wouldn't heal quite right and you would have problems breathing. Or if you broke an arm by some fight, maybe it wouldn't heal properly either, and you would have chronic pain the rest of your life, possibly. Or have to take some kind of painkillers that dull your mind and emotions in general. So people don't necessarily think of all this on a conscious level, but I think it does go on in an unconscious level. And to compensate for these fears, things like over-control are used. In other words, the psychology talking of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Well, I suppose if you're a woman looking to date or otherwise interact with a man, who wants to date someone who's obsessive-compulsive? In other words, a person excessively interested in control. For while that might be useful in some circumstances, like enhancing one's income, what woman wants to be over-controlled by a man emotionally, or just say behaviorally? Furthermore, this over-control is going to manifest typically, I think, in over-control of his emotions too, whereby his sex appeal, his joy, his feelings, and his anger are probably going to be muted by a tendency to want to over-control. So again, what appeal is there sexually, beauty-wise, then, to someone who is muting their emotions? Some psychologists would say you need to be more expressive. But what does expressive mean then, perhaps, if not histrionic, other than not controlling your emotions to the point where you have nothing showing at all except somber faces all the time, or even to the extent of having a deadpan look. Again, this is not very appealing sexually, and thus called lack of beauty. Okay, so on to the next point. Well, I would say my observations too are that people thus who are more frail, tall, thin, are going to be more reactive. Which means if someone were to criticize them and this were to affect their self-esteem, they might be much more reactive than someone of a mesomorphic build, less tall and thin. And how can this possibly be considered beautiful or sexy? To be more reactive, as opposed to more measured and calm, thoughtful, measured. And of course this translating then to planning ability too, and ability to study methodically when needed, stick to task, to develop yourself career-wise and to develop relationships, and just basically to develop the capacity to think without flying off the handle. All of this again related to how reactive we are, and reactivity tied to how vulnerable we feel at any minute to harm, physical harm, or even death. Well, additionally too, I'd say another form of compensating for this vulnerability physically to harm is to become more studious, which confers then a certain type of power, especially if we can plug this into certain careers that one can say monetize to a certain degree, such that these people might not be the sexiest, most beautiful by far, but have something else to offer that many other people might not, like a mesomorphic, good-looking forklift operator, and that is more money to offer women. And so without beauty, perhaps offering money, relatively speaking. And some women willing to make a trade-off that maybe the man doesn't look so good and has higher than average levels of anxiety and thus compensating in various ways. But some people might like the added money coming in. And hey, perhaps even some women figure, well, I'll get my pile of money from somebody and we can always divorce in the future and look for something more suitable in the loving department on the second try. Okay. And I think finally, to wrap this up, I want to look at the topic of submissiveness, whereby a tall, thin, ectomorphic man, more prone to fear of injury, may compensate additionally by being very submissive. And what would be the problem with this in terms of dating, marriage, loving, sexuality, and all of this wrapped up in the word beauty? Well, in my viewpoint, what we're talking about is that submissiveness is not necessarily very appealing when it comes to survival in the world. And so to have a trait whereby one can't stand up for one's needs, one's basic human needs for oneself and one's loved ones in this case, I don't think this is particularly beautiful looking. In other words, very advantageous. And by submissiveness, I don't just mean physically submissive, but mentally too, whereby this can translate into a sort of naivety. One can become submissive to the point of not being able to size others up, to protect oneself, take measures to protect and advance one's own goals. For if one is submissive and then naive, one will not be optimally promoting one's own needs or those of one's spouse or lover. And again, this not looking particularly beautiful thus. So I say all these traits then used to combat vulnerability to harm get unconsciously registered almost split-second notice as a lack of beauty or significant deficit in beauty. And so, what will I say to those who are listening who are males and tall and thin and generally frail and vulnerable to harm because of their size, basically, and predisposition for injury being higher? Well, I suppose there are two avenues. You could carry a weapon out in front or of your body, and thus advertising it as a threat, counter threat. Or you could carry a concealed weapon. That might help you feel better too, thus feel less vulnerable and lower your anxiety levels over harm. Or third, and this is so often done, I think, is that someone might visit a doctor or other practitioner to get, quote, medications to dull the anxiety. And while this might be helpful and an optimal solution for some, perhaps not for others, depending on your career field. And I would say in general, in my opinion, being that this approach, the medical drug approach, dulls emotions and thus, while looking less anxious, also being a little dulled, if not more than a little dulled. And again, that not being particularly sexy, I would say. So what is left then? Well, I would say the leftover alternative is perhaps the hardest to achieve and perhaps the most profitable, so to speak, every way around in the long run. And that is to work through, in one's own mind, the fear of either death or physical injury from someone else who is stronger and bigger, basically, more able to inflict harm. And this is no easy task, for surely one of our greatest fears in life is the fear of death, followed perhaps by the fear of pain physically. I'm reminded, for instance, of a man I met a year or two ago in his 70s who said he didn't want to leave the region he was living in because he had a very good pain doctor lined up administering him pain drugs when needed. And if he moved out of the area, he might not be able to find such a doctor again very easily. The point being that it's not easy to overcome not only the fear of death to a great degree, but the fear of pain inflicted instantaneously from a fight or even an implied fight. What I call saber rattling, so to speak. The term sometimes derogatory in nature being bully, that some people are perhaps bully in nature by their size alone, throwing their weight around, so to speak, and their body size around, and this form of saber rattling, in my opinion. So, I would say then, to the extent one can overcome the fear of death, considerably anyway, and the fear of injury, and I mean chronically injured with pain, chronic pain, this then is probably the gold standard solution for ectomorphs, tall, thin men. And this is, of course, not going to be achieved overnight, and in my opinion, it may often require some assistance from others, either from a friend or relative or paid help. Of course, this not being easy to find, and if of a quality nature, is going to cost quite a bit of money usually, and such people might be booked up for years even, So good are they at helping people with this particular situation. So at any rate, this is how I kind of see what beauty is at the present time, relating basically to males. And I perhaps will think some more about beauty related to females at another point in time. But my being a male and having experienced a lot of these issues myself, these are my observations now after several years. I might throw out another thought or two that I met a man a year or two ago from the Hollywood, California area, and he mentioned his belief that ectomorphs can't make it in Hollywood. So, right there, I think that got me thinking more than anything. Then secondly, a man I was listening to, one of his podcasts the other day, was saying that the older a man gets and still wanting to date, particularly younger women, it being important that he look very good in his appearance and physique. And if he's thin, that he gains some weight and go to the gym and build muscle mass, and perhaps use testosterone treatments too. Well, he didn't mention anything further on this topic of increasing your weight. I believe part and parcel of this is to look more able to defend yourself. So, these are my thoughts again, and well, I'm not 100% sure of the veracity of all this. I present it as food for thought again, and I hope it's useful. If you find some of it very useful and other pieces not, please, feel free to embrace the pluses and chuck the rest. I wish you a good day.